So for the last two modules, we've been talking about the perception of 3D structure sort of generically, looking at different sources of information that tell us about the three-dimensional environment in which we're immersed. For the remaining portions of the course, I want to do two other things that are also important areas of perception. So one of them is recognition. And there are all kinds of applied issues related to this. So this is a really active field in computer vision to be able to recognize objects or faces. I think I may have told you the story earlier. I was really surprised when I went over to Belgium earlier in the semester, and I was about to get on an airplane flying from Atlanta to Belgium. And they didn't ask for my boarding pass. I went through a camera, they took my picture. The picture recognized me, put in, zipped out a new boarding pass and gave it to me. You have any idea how that stuff works? We have, Alicia Martinez is a researcher in electrical engineering and computer science here at OSU. And he's one of the leading guys in the world on face recognition. We'll talk more about that a little bit later. Alicia is also interesting in that he has both an interest in the cognition of face perception and the machine vision of face perception. So now I ask you, do you have any idea how those things work? And are they reliable?
Do you want me to explain?
I'm sorry?
Do you want me to try my best to explain how it works?
Well, just to answer, are they reliable?
No. No. Well, no. Well, the thing is how do you define reliable? Like 90% classification accuracy would be great in one scenario, but
right, and they know who's supposed to be getting on the plane.
Right. 99.9% classification accuracy will kill quite a few people in a Tesla vehicle.
Good point.
All right, so.
We'll get to face recognition a little bit later, which is awkward for me because the guy who's taping me probably knows more about this than I do, but that's okay. He won't let on. So that's one kind of recognition. Recognizing objects is another, and there's several more that we'll talk about that you might not even think of. So we're going to, nothing is working for me today. That's better. Over the next three lectures, we're going to talk about recognition of contours. We've talked a little bit about contours in earlier sections of the course. We're going to talk about object recognition. These two we'll do today. Next time we'll talk about face recognition and scene recognition. And then finally, next Thursday, we will talk about event recognition, which is an interesting field in itself. It was very active in the 1970s, sort of disappeared for a while, and now it's making a big comeback. There are lots of important applications for this as well, but we'll save that for a little bit later. So today we're going to focus on contours and objects. So let's start with contours and objects. What do you see here?
A butt.
A butt. Male butt or female butt?
Hard to tell.
What would be your best guess?
Probably female.
Now, what's amazing about this, and we talked about this when we did line drawings, right? There are only 1, 2, 3, 4 lines on here, and Picasso sort of nails the structure of that butt. In fact, 2 years ago, there's a woman who took this course, I think she was one of my neuroscience majors, who actually had a t-shirt made of this and gave it to me. Unfortunately, my wife refuses to let me wear it anywhere. So as you recall from last time, there are a number of different physical causes for sharp changes of intensity in an image. It can arise from reflectance contours. would be like the plaid pattern on your shirt, where parts of it reflect light differently than other parts. Illumination contours, which would include this contour right here. Shadows or spotlights. Corners, I've called them in the past. They can be either concave or convex. Occlusions, which can be either smooth or corners. And specular highlights and reflections. And this next slide is one I've shown you multiple times, but I'll repeat it again just to remind you of the different types. So there's a reflectance contour, there's a shadow, an illumination contour, a corner, in this case it's concave, smooth occlusion, corner edge occlusion or corner occlusion, and a specular highlight. So what we're going to start off today is how, when you look at a set of contours in an image, how are you able to classify them? That's the question. It turns out that this is the oldest topic in 3D computer vision. So the first researchers to look at this problem was in the mid-1960s. In fact, the very first computer graphics system was developed in the early 60s. So it's not long after that, and people started trying to go the other way. Instead of producing images like you do in computer graphics, let's try to analyze images, which is what you do in computer vision interpretations. And the first problem they took on was the one of identifying contours. And it turns out to be a really hard problem. And the reason why it's really hard is that sometimes, like for example in subjective contours, the contours aren't always spelled out by abrupt changes in intensity, but yet we can identify them nonetheless. So here are some examples. One of the things I want to focus on here is the idea of occlusion contours. This is important. Occlusion contours have an attached and an unattached side. So if you're looking at me right now, right, there's an occlusion contour here that surrounds my face. That contour is attached to my face. It's the structure of my face that defines that contour, not the background behind me. All right, so for this occlusion contour that defines my face, the attached side of this contour is, right, the side where my face is. So here we have an example. Here's a smooth occlusion contour. The attached side is here, the unattached side is over there. The other thing we want to be able to do is to identify corners, whether they're concave or convex. And this shows some examples of that. Now, the model that I'm going to tell you about today is one that was developed by an Indian guy named Jitendra Malik. There are very few. I just told you about Alish Martinez, who is interested both in human vision and machine vision. Jitendra is another guy like that who wears both hats. I think you could probably count the number of computer vision people on one hand who pay much attention to human perception, and Jitendra is one of them. I think the reason why they do that is they think that you can gain insights from your engineering hat by looking at how biology has solved some of these problems. And that used to be all the rage back when computer vision was first starting, but it quickly drifted away from that. And now it's not that way anymore. So the first thing Malik did was to identify a labeling scheme. So the idea is that if you have an occlusion contour, we're going to mark that with an arrow on the contour. If it's a smooth occlusion, we'll put 2 arrows. And if it's a corner or edge occlusion, we'll put a single arrow. And the arrows are pointing in the direction so the attached side is always on the right. Convex corners we're going to mark with a plus, and concave corners we're going to mark with a minus. All right, so this is the space that Malik is dealing in. Now, what drives this is going to, again, come back. Remember when we talked about lightness constancy and how vertices can play a big role in understanding, in being able to distinguish between whether changes in luminance are due to reflectance or whether they're due to changes in illumination. Well, we're going to use those same vertex structure here to try and label the contours in an image. So here we have different kinds of vertices. This would be an arrow vertex. This would be a Y vertex. This would be another arrow vertex. So one of the first things Malik did was he took all these different kinds of vertices and tried to enumerate all the possible interpretations that could arise from them. So if you look at an L vertex, all these interpretations are possible. Curved L looks something like this. You're down to 4. This 3 tangent one is really interesting. It only has a single interpretation. So what that says is this is a smooth occlusion contour. This is a corner and a concave corner, and this is a corner occlusion. Arrows have 3, Ys have 5, Ts have 2. So here's the problem of edge labeling. Note that every contour on an object is bounded on both ends by a vertex. Problem. Select a possible interpretation for each vertex so that every contour has a consistent labeling on both of its vertices. Right? So let's say I have a line in the image, and I have a vertex here, and I have a vertex here, and each of these vertices allows a certain number of interpretations. I want to always pick one so that the interpretation on one side of the line is the same as the other side of the line. Consistent interpretations are not always unique. We can have impossible figures where there is no consistent set of interpretations, and may sometimes be they may sometimes be impossible to achieve. So that's the impossible figure, but they also may have multiple interpretations that are possible as well. So let's see if I can lay this out for you. So let's take this complicated object right here. This one has 3 possible interpretations. And the way to spot them is on this bottom part here. So minus sign means what? Concave edge. So what is this interpretation? This says this object is sitting on a floor, that this is actually a surface here. All right, so to label these as a concave edge means you're interpreting this thing as resting on the ground. As opposed to over here, how are you interpreting it? As pinned up against the wall. Right, so this thing is attached to a wall over here. And this one, where you see you have arrows all the way around, this is an interpretation where the object is just floating in air. Right, so imagine an object is just floating in air, then all around its boundary will be an occlusion contour. If it's attached to something, then where it's attached, you'll get these concave corners. So in this case, it's attached on the bottom, and in this case, it's attached on the side. Any questions about this before I move on? So again, just to summarize, yeah?
Oh, so does that mean like anytime an object is attached to something, it's always going to have like a concave?
Yes.
So it can't never have a convex
Can it have a convex on its outer perimeter? Yeah, it can here. Like right. Well, if it can be convex, but it'll be an occlusion. The perimeter, by definition, is always an occlusion. All right, so you can think of this as you're solving a bunch of constraints simultaneously, right? So you say, all right, I've got some number of interpretations for this vertices, I got some number from this, so I'll pick a solution where I get the same interpretation of this line, and then that propagates all over the whole surface. So in this case, there are three possible alternatives. Now, how well do humans do this? So I'm going to tell you about an experiment that's never been published. It was a PhD thesis of one of my students who never wrote it up, which disappointed me because I really thought it was a nice experiment. But anyway, here it is. So what he did is he would show objects little pieces of an object that looked like this. So the idea here is that let's say you just focus on just the tiniest piece of an edge you can. It would be impossible to know what kind of edge it was. You need contextual information from the other vertices in the scene in order to interpret what's going on. And so the idea is we start really small and then make the apertures bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, and then we'd have the subjects rate what they think they're seeing for each size until they finally get the correct answer. That's the goal here. And so here's what the response looks like. So if they see this one right here, subjects might say, all right, I think that's a convex corner, and I'm confident about 80% of that. They can also judge it as any of these other kinds of things as well. They'd press the next slide, and then they'd go on to the next image and do that all over again. So here's examples of some of the structures that we showed them. See if I can find one here that's ambiguous.
Is the second one ambiguous?
I'm sorry?
Is the second one ambiguous? Like it could be concave or convex?
It could be concave, convex, you're right. All y's in isolation, anytime you see a y in isolation, is always ambiguous. However, when we talked about biases in perception, what was one of our main biases?
Oh, that we want to see stuff
We want to see stuff convex. And that shows up here as well. All right, so here's an example of how things would go. You first get this. Subjects typically adjust all the sliders because they have zero confidence in anything for this one. Then you get a bigger aperture, and that's when the first vertex appears. And this could be a convex or a concave corner. Can anybody see the concave interpretation in this one? I see a few heads. I was trying this morning, I couldn't see it. I have a very strong convexity bias. Then when this thing kicks in right here, then that eliminates the concave interpretation, and you now see this as convex. Or at least mathematically it's defined as convex. So what we're trying to do, right, there's a theory that says you need certain amount of vertex information in order to correctly label this thing. And so the question is, what would happen to observers' labelings before they have enough information, followed by after they, so do they get the right interpretation as soon as they have enough constraints in order to solve the problem? And here's what the data look like. So correct rejections, these are the ones where, so let's say it's a corner, and this is the slider for shadows. Subjects typically just adjust that to be 0. But you often get these two patterns of results. So for the correct identification, right, so let's say the contour you're trying to identify really is a concave corner. what'll happen is that subjects' ratings for that go up, and then asymptote, usually around 90% confidence. And this happens almost always at exactly the time where there are enough constraints present to solve this mathematically. But you also get this pattern right here. Where notice the subject goes up, has a pretty high confidence, and then new information comes in, and all of a sudden, no, I was wrong, and it goes back down here. Now, the most common time that that occurs is when it's a concave corner. Remember, subjects have a big bias to see convexity, and so they'll judge, oh, that's this would be a good example of that here. So most subjects would judge this to be convex. You'd get an initial spike of confidence until a new vertex comes in and reveals that it's actually concave. And that's when the convex response goes down and the concave one starts to go up. So the data look like, do you have a question? So the data look like what subjects are doing is very much like what Malik's model is suggesting. Now, a couple things to point out here. Malik's model only deals with occlusions and corners, right? So nobody knows how to deal with specular highlights, shadows, reflectance contours. There is a model more recent than Malik's. I don't want to go into it because it's highly technical, by two mathematicians. There's a guy named Jim Damon at University of North Carolina and another guy over in Liverpool who have extended it. Yeah.
All right. So you're saying they really work with specular highlights or shadows, but in that model, or in that experiment, you had a bar for shadows and specular highlights. Did people ever choose that, or did they always?
Well, we were using a more sophisticated model than Malik, so we took into account this newer model that does do shadows.
Okay.
But I don't have a slide that lays out all those interpretations for you. So they do shadows, but they don't do highlights. So the Giblin and Damon model works with corners, occlusions, and shadows. The Malik model just works with corners and occlusions. Now, it's also interesting to point out the other cases where there are no possible interpretations. So how would you interpret this? Is this a correct labeling of that? Who shall I pick on? Let's pick on you. All right, this double arrow means smooth occlusion. And the attached side is to the right. You would say this is the way to label this? How many of you think that's a correct labeling? Raise your hand. All right, smooth occlusion. You get that without any ambiguity at all because of this three tangent thing. That one only has a single interpretation. And the attached side is to the right here. However, let's now look at this. What's the correct interpretation here? So if I label it this way, what's it saying? What does the arrow mean? Arrow means it's an occlusion, and that means that this is just empty space on this side. The attached side is over here. If it's a minus sign, that means it's a concave corner, which this is not empty space, it's actually a face of the object. But now what happens when we put them all together? All right, so there is no interpretation of this vertex that's compatible with any interpretation over here. And this is a classic example of an impossible figure. In fact, this one has a name. It's called the Devil's Pitchfork. This was invented back in the 50s by a guy named Penfield. Here's another example of a devil's pitchfork. Again, it looks like 3 columns here, but not up here. Similar kind of thing here. Which is the leg, this or that? Again, for these, there's no consistent interpretation because it's an impossible figure. Yeah? No, it's actually a positive attribute of the model because the model can't find a consistent set of labelings here, but this is not a possible object. So the model is telling you which ones are possible and which ones are impossible. That's a good attribute of the model.
So it's weird that as a human being, say
I can't hear you.
This is doing, his model would be the same as a human would, which would say that this is him.
Yeah, with one caveat to that, and that is if you present this really fast, like for 20 milliseconds, subjects won't notice that it's impossible. They have to peruse it a bit before that sinks in on them. And even some, I'll show you one later where it's difficult to figure out why it's impossible, even though you know it is. Okay, let's consider a T-vertex again. We've had lots of discussion about that again when lightness. So what this vertex is telling us is that this is an occlusion contour. It could be a smooth occlusion or it could be a corner occlusion. And now let's look at this. One more point. Whenever you have a T-junction, it means that the stuff on this side of the crossbar is always in front of the base because it's an occlusion. All right, so this is always in front of that when you have a T-junction here or there. So now let's look at the impossible triangle. What makes this impossible? Anybody want to venture a guess? All right, we'll just track it through. I have that T-junction there, right? And this T-junction is telling me that A is in front of B. Region A, this region right here, is in front of B, which is this region right here. You all agree with that? All right, let's take the next one. This T-junction tells me that B is in front of C. You all agree with that? That T-junction tells me C is in front of A. Which, in other words, B is closer than C, C is closer than A is closer than B. That violates, there's a mathematical principle that this violates in spades. Anybody know the name for it? It's called transitivity. You had it and didn't want to speak up?
Well, the space part threw me off because I was just thinking of like math theorems, properties of it.
So A is less than B is less than C is less than A. That just doesn't work. So this is the labeling schemes are telling you this is an impossible figure. Now we get the same thing here. Here it's not so easy to track. But let's say we start here, right? And we're going down, 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 and then down, 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 and then down, 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 and then down, 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 and down, 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 down. You know that's impossible. I assume you all know that's impossible. You can't continually go down forever. But there's so many vertices here, you get lost in the, so this one, it's not, it clearly is impossible, but it's not completely intuitive what makes it impossible. Here's Escher's version of that. You all heard about a perpetual motion machine? Well, this would be it. So the water falls down here, and then it turns this wheel, and then it goes down and goes down and goes down and goes down, and then falls off the waterfall again. Not a possible event. All right, so this is the identification of contours. There's not a ton of research on this. I don't exactly know why. And the reason for that is that identifying contours is crucial for almost every single model that I told you in the last 2 modules of the course. Right, so in order to do shape from texture, structure from motion, shape from stereo, all those things, work on some subsets of different contour types and not others. So to actually have a practical working version of those models, you would have to do something like edge labeling in order to get them to work. Either that or you restrict your environment so that the bad contours are not allowed to occur. All right, so let's switch gears now. And I want to get into object recognition. Somebody want to tell me what you see here? Let's pick on you this time. Tell me what you see up there. This thing here?
Mm-hmm. And then it has kind of like an input box where I imagine you put something in.
This thing here?
Yeah. And then maybe a wheel that it's on and then an output too.
That thing here?
Mm-hmm.
And what's this?
Some sort of crank that gear process.
Okay, and what about this? You haven't described that yet. And how about that?
That seems like some sort of like tube that things to come out of.
Okay. Is there anybody in the class who would have described this any differently than that? Now, some people may have said, well, that's a handle or a tail, perhaps. But you always get, I mean, I've been doing this class for 20 years and teaching this model for almost that long. And every single person I have ever asked to do this does exactly what she did. They proceed to talk about the individual parts of the object. So it's the idea here that the object is defined by the parts with which it's composed. So the most often descriptions of this, people describe that as a wheel. People describe that as a box, a hose, a handle, a spring, and 2 funnels. Now, the problem for object recognition is the following. Somebody tell me what this object is. It's a teapot. Now, would you have recognized the teapot from that view?
Maybe.
She's very confident. How about that view?
Yeah.
All right, so the idea here, and this is what makes object recognition so hard, and face recognition, right, is we can identify objects from different vantage points, different patterns of illumination, they can be different sizes, and yet we're able to still recognize them as teapots. And so the question that people have been trying to ask for a long time is, how are we able to do that? And to what extent are we able to do that? Now I'm going to tell you, in the rest of the class, about 3 different kinds of models. So one of them is a template model, or also called a view-based model. And that is that you maintain a memory of many different views of each object that we need to recognize. All right, so from that, if I come into class and you recognize me as Professor Todd, you know, you might have a fronto mental image of me and a three-quarter mental image of me and a profile image of me, and, you know, maybe with my head tilted up and one with my head tilted down and one where I make a funny face. And you store all those images, and then when I walk into the room, all right, you see me, and then you scan through all those images that you have stored, and you see if any of them match. And if any of them match, you say, aha, that's Professor Todd. If they don't match, then this is an imposter. Maybe Professor Todd arranged a guest lecture. Maybe it's a student I haven't seen before. Whatever it is, it's not Professor Todd. When I first started teaching, nobody would mistake me for a student now, but when I was a young assistant professor, I looked like I was 16, 17. And I would frequently come into class and just sit down in the back on the first day of class, and the students would come in, they'd be chatting with each other, and I wouldn't say anything. And then, you know, after a while, I would just get up and walk to the front of the class, and they would be freaked out because, is that a student? Is that the professor?
Did they ever say anything?
What's that?
Did you ever hear them say anything you wish you hadn't?
Well, I did have one say one time when I was putting some stuff in the library on reserve. It was before we had Carmen. Things were so different back then. And the girl at the reserve desk asked, I said, I want to put this on reserve for the course number. And she said, oh, are you taking that? And I said, yeah, I'm the professor. He goes, no way. I had a similar thing when I was in graduate school. So I was a teaching assistant. I had a faculty parking sticker. And so I went and drove up in the faculty lot, and there was a meter maid comes in. I was in cutoff shorts and a ratty old t-shirt, and the meter maid comes up and looks at me. And she says, only faculty can park here. And so I pointed to the faculty sticker. She looks at me, she looks at the sticker, she looks at me, looks at the sticker. She says, it's your dad's car, isn't it? I said, you caught me. I wasn't going to argue with her as long as I didn't get a ticket. So feature hierarchy models are a little different. For those of you who are in neuroscience here, as there are many of you, this model is based on neuroscience results, in particular what we know about the inferior temporal cortex. I don't know if you remember way back from the first module, but I talked about the cells in there have really big receptive fields. They don't really care where an object or pattern appears within the receptive field. And we also know from brain damage that if you damage that part of the brain, that's where you start to get impairments in object recognition. So feature hierarchy models are based directly on that, and I'll give you more details about this a little bit later. And then finally, we have a thing called structural description models, which exploit those properties that can distinguish most objects from one another, yet remain relatively stable over changes in view. So these things are going to exploit the non-accidental properties that we talked about earlier. So let's first start with a template model. You all know what correlation is, right? If you all had statistics and know what a correlation is. And do you understand how you could correlate two images together? So an image is just a set of numbers, right? And if I have two images that are the same size, I pair those numbers, you'll get a correlation of some magnitude. So a template model would say, all right, I've got this internal representation of a chair. And now I want to know, is that chair in this image? And so what would you do? Well, what you do is you take this template and scan it over the whole image there. At each position, calculate a correlation, and then you can represent that as a map, which looks something like that. You see this big bright spot right there? That says, I got a really high correlation at that spot. And that's evidence that this chair is in fact there, and it's at this position. Now, can anybody think of any problems with this model? Yeah.
Requires the exact same perspective.
Requires exact same perspective. By that, I assume you mean orientation, size. Upholstery obviously has to be the same. Yeah.
Is the model measuring like contours, or is this taking into account like color and edges?
I'm sorry?
Is the model measuring contours only, or is it measuring like?
It's just measuring pixels.
Okay.
Just measuring pixels.
Does that-
Now, you could ignore the color if you wanted to. You could desaturate the image to do it, or you could take color into account. So either way would be, you could do it in principle. I suspect they would desaturate this and not worry about the colors, but you could easily do that. It's just a bigger data set over which you're doing the correlations. So this is a template model. It's really brain dead. But there are people who actually believe this. Some very prominent folks who actually believe that this is what humans do. And here's an example of that. So this is an experiment by, who did this experiment? I don't remember. Be Heinrich Bulthoff or Tomas Poggio. Somebody within that group. So what they did was they asked subjects to try and learn to identify different bent wire coat hangers. Now you may think for a second, that's pretty odd. We don't recognize bent wire coat hangers. That's not something we do naturally. But that's what they had subjects do. And let's say they trained them with this view and then tested them with a bunch of other views. And sure enough, what they found was subjects are really crummy unless the test view is really close to the view they trained with, in which case performance is really high. I think this experiment may actually have been done on monkeys. But so this has been used in evidence to support a template-based view in either human or monkey perception. Now again, the problem is this is not something that you would typically recognize. I mean, you also say if you have bent paper clips on your desk and you had 2 or 3 of them, could you really recognize one over another? Probably not. So image-based approaches to object recognition, they can't really distinguish, this is the problem, things that are relevant to the identity of the objects from things that are irrelevant. And let's look at this example here. So are these 2 images of the same object? How many of you think yes? Raise your hand. All right, but the images themselves are quite different. You couldn't just correlate this with that. You'd get a really low correlation. So here the shadows on the left, here the shadows on the right. Notice the backgrounds in different orientations on the 2 views. Yet we do this trivially. And in fact, you could even strip this down to a line drawing like so, and can easily say that these are the same object. This is the same object as this one, and the same object as this one. So, I mean, image-based model isn't going to work at all with something like this. But yet, that's a perfectly good stimulus for human observers. And so the question is, how could we possibly deal with that? So this brings us to object recognition by components. It's a famous paper by Irv Biederman in 1987. I think this is the 3rd most cited paper in all of perceptual psychology. Very influential paper. And Irv is a very controversial character. And because of that, a lot of people want to think he's wrong just on principle. I think he's mostly right, but maybe I'm just weird. So in Biederman's theory, objects are defined as configurations of qualitatively distinct parts that he calls Jions. And Jions are defined by configurations of non-accidental properties. Let's show you how this works. So here we have non-accidental properties. What are they? Distinction between straight and curved, cotermination, like you see here, versus not cotermination, parallelism, and symmetry. Now, where does the term non-accidental properties come from? We haven't seen this in a while. Yeah.
Is that the specific view where you like?
Right. So you can have cotermination by accident, or parallelism by accident. Right. So my arm may look collinear to you from that viewpoint, but everybody else can see that it's curved. All right. So the basic idea is, and this was the basis of a lot of illusions that we saw earlier, your brain makes an assumption that non-accidental properties can't happen by accident. And the other thing I want to do is relate this back to that Klein hierarchy of geometry. So straight versus curved is a projective property. Cotermination is a topological property. Parallelism is an affine property. These two are in particular mean that they don't change with the view. Right? So if you're looking at a straight line, can I borrow your notebook for a second? Oh, pen works fine. Pen works fine. Pen's even better. Right? So if this thing is a straight line, you can look at it from any orientation you want. It's always going to be a straight line in the image of your eye. All right, it's not going to change. Now, as I said, you could have a spurious straight line like this that looks straight from one attribute, but not for a generic view. Cotermination works the same way. Parallelism, not quite as general as the other two, because in high perspective, right, parallel lines don't stay parallel in the image, but yet they're still used by humans. So the basic idea here is because these properties don't change with viewpoint, right? If we base our identification of objects on these properties, then the viewpoint isn't going to make any difference because they don't change with the viewpoint. So here are the different kinds of Jions. They're distinguished by the number of straight and curved edges, which edges are parallel to one another, the number of vertices of each type, and the presence of symmetries. And so here we've got a number of different Jion types: edge, straight, curve, straight, straight, curve, straight. The type of symmetry that you have is the size constant or expanding along the symmetry axis. Is the axis curved or straight? So let's consider two, a brick and a cylinder. So a brick is defined by, you have three parallel edges, here, 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 an inner Y vertex, three outer arrow vertices, here, here, and here, as opposed to a cylinder where you have two tangent Y vertices, here and here, curved edge here, here, and here, two parallel straight edges here and here. All right, so just by listing that stuff, you can distinguish the different geometric elements from one another. So Biederman focuses primarily on Jions. You could just as easily focus on the non-accidental properties. Because non-accidental properties are defining the Jions. The Jions are, according to Biederman, what's defining the object. So let's take a set of Jions like these and put them together in different combinations, and you get a telephone, a briefcase, a lamp, a pail, a coffee cup. Now this one is an interesting distinction because it has the same two Jions, but they're in a different relationship with each other. So for the coffee cup, right, the loop is off to the side of the cylinder, whereas for the pail, it's on top. And so you can create a variety of objects doing that way. Now, he tested his model in a number of ways. The first way was to just eliminate Jions. So he had an artist actually create all these objects, and then he would have the artist erase different Jions or distort different Jions or do various things like that. And so here we have a penguin where you take out the tail and one of the wings, and here you take out the feet and the other wing, and here you take out the eye. And so the question is, how many Jions can you delete and still be able to recognize the object as a penguin? We can do a similar thing with a flashlight or a wine glass. And one of the things Biederman found is that as long as you have about, in most cases, 3 Jions is enough to specify an object uniquely. Now, one prediction of his model is that if you delete contours in an image, they should have a greater effect if it masks the non-accidental properties. And I'll try to show you some examples of this. So let's say, now, here I have an image of a cup, and I'm going to delete sections of the contour, sort of midsection. So all the vertices are still intact here, but I've eliminated a proportion of the contours. So here 25% have been eliminated, here 65% have been eliminated. But now we can also eliminate the contours at the vertex. Remember, vertex is critical information in order to define the Jion structure. It's defined based on those vertices. So the prediction is if you take the same amount of contours out, but those contours are at the vertices, the impairment in your recognition ought to be much higher. And so here's what you get here with 25, 45, and 65% contour deletion. This one I don't think anybody would be able to recognize as a cup, whereas you might be able to recognize that one. So this is intact objects, midsection deletion, vertex deletion, and subjects are much better in the midsection deletion than they are in the vertex deletion. So their reaction times are faster and their overall accuracy is higher. Here's another example where you have intact object, midsection deletion. Now instead of removing the vertices, we're removing the whole Jions. Subjects are better in this case than they are in that case. So all of these are consistent with what you would expect if observers were using the non-accidental properties to define the Jions, and the Jions are being used to define the basis of the object. And again, I just want to reinforce this because this is the most important aspect of this letter. Why use Jions, or a better way to phrase it, why use non-accidental properties to identify these things? Because they don't change with viewpoint. Right? You don't have to calculate. Yeah.
Can you repeat which one you said they were better at, midsection and Jion, in this case?
Why you're better here than you do there?
Or just which one is better?
Oh, the midsection is better than the Jion deletion.
Really? Okay.
And the reason for that is the critical information is all the vertex structure, and you're leaving that intact here.
Oh, okay.
You're losing, this isn't as bad as the vertex deletion is, but it's still worse than the midsection deletion. Any other questions before I go on? Yeah?
So Jion doesn't change his viewpoint? You said Jion doesn't change his viewpoint?
I'm not understanding your question.
What did you say didn't change his viewpoint?
Okay, the non-accidental properties don't change with viewpoint. And the Jions are defined based on the non-accidental properties. So if you're using non-accidental properties to get the Jions, that's not going to be affected by changing in viewpoint. Now, it might be affected, so let's say you look at the front of my face and I turn around, So nothing in one view is similar to what you saw in another. There are limits to that. But to the extent that you're seeing the same features in both views, straight lines aren't going to turn curved, and parallel lines aren't going to turn non-parallel, and coterminations aren't going to suddenly terminate. Yeah?
Is there any comparison between the Jions deletion and the Vertex deletion? Performing better between.
This is the hardest one.
Okay.
I probably should have put these in opposite order. So you're losing some vertices here, but others are remaining intact, whereas in this case, most of the information that's essential you're losing. All right, let me walk you through this next experiment. What time does this class end? Okay. So notice here we have 4 different kinds of objects with contour deletion in both parts. And here we have an object. So this is a lock. This is a different kind of lock. Now what's interesting here is that these 2 contour deletions are complementary. So half the contours in this object have been eliminated here, and all the ones that are eliminated are in this one. So if you put these 2 objects together, you get that. So, and do the same thing with the flashlight, with the elephant, and with the piano. So the idea behind this experiment, it employs what's called priming. I don't think we've talked about that in this class. So the basic idea is, let's say I show you a picture of me, and you have to identify it. You have to say the name of the person in the picture as fast as you possibly can. And so I show you a picture of me, you name it, and then we go through a bunch of other pictures of different people, and then say after another 10 trials, I show you another picture of me, and you'll name it. If you look at the reaction time to the second occurrence, it's typically faster than the first one. And the basic idea behind that is that once you've activated your mental representation of me, that there's a residual activation that takes a while to dissipate, and then if you show the same picture again, you get full activation much more quickly. So, first block of trials, the subjects see just these. And this is the mean response time. Then if you show an identical image on a subsequent block, notice the reaction time is much faster and the errors are reduced. That's the priming effect. Now, priming here can happen for 2 reasons. It could be because of the name that you're accessing, a flashlight or an elephant, or it could be because of the visual representation. And Biederman controls for this in a really clever way, which is by having another object with the same name, but not the same visual representation. And so if you look at a different exemplar of the same name, this is non-visual priming, the difference between these 2. Right? But the priming that you get here, this part of it is due to the visual representation. And the main thing to note here is you get the same amount of priming from the identical contour deleted image as you do from the complementary contour deleted image. So the observers are somehow filling in the whole structure of the Jions. It doesn't depend on the particular contours that you're looking at. All right, let me say a brief word about feature hierarchy models. And I'll keep it brief. As I told you before, these are based on neurophysiological results from infratemporal cortex. And the main thing we know there is they have big receptive fields, and they don't really care where in the receptive field a feature occurs. They're pretty agnostic about that. And so as a result, you might think of those neurons as just detecting a feature. They're like a bag of features, right? Without any connections between them. So let's say you look at this, and your infratemporal cortex might be representing it like this, with this set of features here. Now, I find it mind-boggling that anyone would propose this. It makes no sense, because how the features are connected are a critical part of what shape is all about. But if all you pay attention to is to infratemporal cortex, then this makes some sense. How many neuroscience majors we have in here? Okay, so this might appeal to you, because it's based on real neuroscience. Oh, and by the way, these theories work. If you do a competition, they have competitions in machine object recognition, and these hold their own really well. Nobody's really tested Biedermann's model because there is no model for finding the non-accidental properties. That's the hard part of that one. So Hayworth, Yu, and Biedermann did this wonderful experiment where, again, they used complementary contour-deleted objects, like this one and this one. And then they had identical objects here where the features are entirely scrambled. All right, so this one and this one have completely different set of contours. This one and this one looks like have exactly the same set of contours, but the contours here are scrambled. Here's another example. This one and this one have different contours entirely. This one and this one have, or this one, one of these two, has the same set of contours, but the contours are scrambled. So let's say you're a feature hierarchy model. Which of these two cases would be easier? It'd be easier to distinguish this from this or this from that? Which one are you pointing to?
The left in the middle,
And why do you say that?
because it cares about the features not in the order that they're in.
Right, so they got exactly the same contours. Feature hierarchy model says this should be easier than that. And if you test a feature hierarchy model, that's exactly what you find. Feature hierarchy model is completely clueless in this case. Gets 0 level recognition, can't do it at all. And they get 100% performance in this case. What do you think you get if you do it with people? Any guesses? Could you identify those as being the same thing? No, of course not. The human results are exactly the opposite. This is about as strong a piece of data as you could have, right? So the model is 100% accurate when you give them this or this, and 0% accurate if you give them that or that. Humans are exactly the opposite. They do almost perfectly comparing this. They're completely clueless if you ask them to compare this to anything. So that's pretty strong evidence that whatever observers are doing, they're not using sets of unattached visual features as you might think by looking at single-cell data in infratemporal cortex. And I think that, not the last slide until all the questions are done. What you got?
I just wanted to know if priming had an effect here, because it seems to me as if you show the lock that you would be able to compare it. So,
Well, in this particular experiment, they didn't look at priming, so I don't know if you did priming. I do know, though, this is pretty much uninterpretable.
okay.
What's your intuition? Do you think you could say those were the same?
I don't know, maybe because I'm looking at all three of them, I think, but yeah, I feel like if you showed me the lock first, I'd be able to say like, okay, that's a lock.
All right, she's got a good point. This is a fair point. Let me say it a little differently. So for this one, remember I first said this was a scrambled version of that one,
Yeah.
but then I noted this thing right here, and it isn't over there. This feature isn't in this set, whereas this feature is in this set, right? So if you're really given time to peruse, you might be able to do it by paying careful attention to the features. However, the way this experiment's done is you never see all three of them together. Any other questions? All right then, I hope, yeah.
So do you mean this model doesn't work, isn't the way human works, right?
Yes. So now Biederman's conclusion for this is we must be using Jions. All right, now let me hold off since I've got a few minutes left in class. We want to address so if all the data seem to be supporting Biederman's theory, why don't the machine vision people use it? And in order to try and explain that, let's go back to these slides. What they have to have is a front-end analysis that's able to go in and say, find all the parallel contours, label the vertices. Those turn out to be hard problems, right? Biederman's model assumes a whole lot of professional difficult processing at the front end that the machine vision people don't know how to solve. And if they don't know how to solve all the steps, then it's useless to them as a computational model. So it may be the case that Biederman is a correct description of what people are doing, but if he doesn't lay it out with sufficient detail that you could actually implement the thing, then from a computer vision point of view, it's completely worthless. And so people use what they can, and they do the best job that they can. Right? Let's say you're a graduate student in computer vision, right? And you're assigned, all right, I'm going to write a program that does object recognition. Right? At the end of the day, you better have a program that recognizes objects or you're not getting your PhD. Right? So Biederman may have a great idea, but if you can't implement it, it's not worth anything. But our job in this class is not the job of an engineer. It's the job of a perceptual psychologist or cognitive scientist. So what I'm interested in is how humans do it. And what these data are showing, I think quite compellingly, is whatever humans are doing, it's not the same as what the current best algorithms in computer vision are doing. So on that note, I'll let you go, unless there's another question.